What's up everyone and welcome back to the World History Channel. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button today. Let's get started. 17 bizarre and mind-boggling facts about Mozart's genius and insanity often go hand in hand, so it should come as no surprise Mozart, the paramount musical genius of the Western world, was kinda off his rocker. An eccentric man known in modern times for lunacy thanks in part to the film Amadeus, in which he's portrayed as a complete nutcase bestowed with inimitable gifts by the gods of music. Mozart did his fair share of bizarre things. Weird things Mozart did run the gamut from telling jokes befitting a 7-year-old while writing some of the most sophisticated symphonies of all time to asking his wife not to bathe because the dangers of it made him anxious. As told anecdotes or letters written by his own hand, evidence of Mozart's eccentricities may have you wondering exactly what was going on his head as he guffawed over fart jokes while writing the magic flute. You've come to the right place if you're a classical music fan looking to laugh out loud at some funny things Mozart did, or just finished watching 3 hours of the Netflix director's cut of Amadeus. Read on for a list of weird Mozart stories, and to discover some of the most outlandish aspects of this world-renowned composer's life. He began writing music at the age of 5 because he possessed extraordinary musical talents. Mozart's musical genius is so staggering it would be unbelievable were it not true. His ability to perform and compose complex pieces of music at an age at which most children struggle to read chapter books boggles the mind, and is frankly bizarre. Mozart started learning music from his sister's lesson book when he was 3 years old, and could play minuets by the age of 4. He started writing music when he was 5 years old, and by the time he was 6, he was touring the world as a performer, encouraged by his father, Leopold. According to eyewitnesses, he could improvise astoundingly well at the same age, playing his own material for hours on end. Mozart was able to recall the music from a single performance of a work when he was a teenager. The kicker: half of the symphonies he wrote were composed between the ages 8 and 19. Phil Grabsky, director of the documentary In Search of Mozart, sees the composer's preternatural gifts in a different light. Of Mozart, Grabsky said, "What the characters we sometimes call geniuses have in common is drive and determination, often good parenting, and the fact that they are products of the social conditions of their time." All of this was true for Mozart. His talent wasn't simply a gift from God, it was the result of tremendously hard work. Goethe saw Mozart perform at age 7, and compared his genius to Shakespeare's. In 1763, seminal German writer Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, pictured above, saw Mozart in concert in Frankfurt. Mozart was 7, Goethe 14. Goethe wrote about genius much later, defining it as the ability to consistently produce works that have consequences and last a lifetime. He also said that all of Mozart's works are of this type. He described Mozart's genius as unreal and compared it to that of William Shakespeare and the Italian Renaissance painter Raphael. Goethe wasn't the only historical luminary taken with Mozart's gifts. Austrian composer Joseph Haydn, who was 24 years Mozart's senior and a tutor to both him and Beethoven, told Mozart's father, "Before God and as an honest man, Wolfgang was the greatest composer he'd ever encountered, either in person or through published music." His father was also an eccentric, and their relationship was bizarre and extreme. Although it is debatable in academic circles whether Leopold Mozart exploited and manipulated his son or whether his overbearing drive and insistence on success made Mozart who he was, for better or worse, he was a monstrous man. Maybe the truth is a little bit of both. Like trophy kids of today, Mozart lived with constant pressure to succeed placed upon by his father, himself a musician. Leopold quit his job so he and Mozart could embark on lengthy, grueling tours, the profits from which he pocketed. While these tours took their toll on Mozart and contributed to his eccentricities, scholar Ruth Halliwell argues they also made him who he was, as did Leopold's recognition that his son's musical gifts far eclipsed his own and, therefore, that Mozart should receive the best musical education possible. As Mozart grew up, Leopold vociferously opposed his marriage and routinely shamed him for his spendthrift ways. When Mozart finally broke away, his father wrote a manipulative letter. "Your whole intent is to ruin me so you can build your castles in the air." Leopold also tried to persuade his son to stay close to him by blaming him for his mother's death while they were in Paris together. "I hope that, after your mother had to die in Paris already, you will not burden your conscience by expediting the death of your father." He proposed to a woman, then told her to lick his butt and married her sister. At 21, Mozart met German opera singer Aloysia Weber and her 3 sisters on a trip to Mannheim. Weber was 16 and seductive, a stunning soprano. Shortly after meeting her, Mozart proposed, though could offer relatively little. He was unemployed, struggling to find a position in Mannheim. She told him she would consider the proposal. In the meantime, Mozart traveled to Paris, hoping to find a job. He saw Aloysia again after leaving Paris, on a visit to Munich. She pretended not to know him, or maybe even actually forgot him, and was pregnant and married to a tall, handsome actor. Infuriated, Mozart sat down at a nearby piano and belted out a spiteful tune, allegedly containing the lyric, "The one who doesn't want me can lick my butt." But everything turns out well in the end. Mozart married Aloysia's younger sister, Constanze, who was 14 or 15 when he first met her, Dirty Dog Wolfgang. Additionally, he composed a number of works for Aloysia to perform. He loved vulgarity and wrote his cousin a letter that reads like juvenile Marquis de Sade. Mozart's love of vulgarity appears frequently in writing. Take, for example, a letter sent to his 19-year-old cousin Maria Anna, who he purportedly had a crush on. The first sentence contains 4 childlike rhyming pairs: writing biting, aunt slant, Uncle Garfunkel, and well Mel. He repeats this pattern throughout the letter, sometimes to make a point, God fraud, sometimes nonsensically, stroke choke. Halfway through his missive, Mozart includes the phrase, "Oh, my ass burns like fire." He wonders whether he has to take a dump, which he can apparently taste in the air, then reports on a long and melancholic sound trumpeted by his ass. He returns to this topic 2 paragraphs later, writing, "I can hear something in the street. I stop writing, get up, go to the window, and the noise is gone. I sit down again, start writing once more. I have barely written 10 words when I hear the noise again. I rise. But as I rise, I can still hear something, but very faint. It smells like something burning. Wherever I go it stinks. When I look out the window, the smell goes away. When I turn my head back to the room, the smell comes back. Finally my mama says to me, 'I bet you let one go.' But that's not all. 'Wee, by the love of my skin, I shit on your nose so it runs down your chin.' Propos. Do you also have the spuny cuny fate? What? Whether you still love me?" He writes alongside his poem of goodbye and 10,000 kisses to his cousin. Because he didn't behave like a servant, he was literally kicked out of a palace. Most musicians of Mozart's time were employed by royalty or nobles, and Mozart was no exception. He was the court organist for Prince Archbishop of Salzburg Hieronymus von Colloredo when his opera I Dominio premiered to great acclaim. However, musicians and artists of the time were typically treated like servants. They were brought out to perform, and afterward, along with the rest of the serving class, they ate dinner in the kitchen. Although Mozart's refusal to act like a servant was revolutionary for the time, it also reflected the composer's ego and bizarre, almost obstinate mental state. He unilaterally decided some of the concerts von Colloredo had him perform were not included in the terms of their arrangement, and therefore demanded separate payment for them, which he didn't get. At one high society function, Mozart, who, like all servants, was not meant to mingle with noble guests, caused a scandal by brazenly striking up a conversation with a Russian ambassador he knew. Mozart's refusal to apologize for his transgressions, even after his father went to great lengths to smooth everything over with the Prince Archbishop, resulted in him literally being kicked out of von Colloredo's house, along with all his possessions. He had bizarre obsessions surrounding his wife, such as his fear of her dying in the bath. Anecdotal evidence indicates Mozart was a classic obsessive-compulsive who fixated on objects, thoughts, and the repetition of certain ideas. In letters to his wife, he expresses an irrational fear of her leaving the home, so much so you have to wonder whether he would have been better off marrying an agoraphobic. Messages like, "Never go out walking alone, it terrifies me," and "Please do not go to the casino today" were sent frequently. There's also cause to believe he was afraid of her drowning in the bath. One note stated, "I implore you to take a 1-hour bath every other day. But if you want me to feel quite easy on my mind, do not take them at all until I am with you again." Either that or he liked to be dirty. Or soiledness. Filthy little Mozart. His strange behavior may have been the result of severe Tourette's syndrome. Mozart has been depicted in popular culture as a quirky but lovable man who occasionally engaged in childlike or irresponsible behavior. In point of fact, Mozart's behavior suggests that he suffered from coprolalia, also known as the involuntary utterance of obscene words. His brother-in-law Joseph Lang, the guy who knocked up Aloysia, stated, "Never was Mozart less recognizably a great man in his conversation and actions than when he was busied with an important work. He took delight in throwing into sharp contrast the divine ideas of his music with these sudden outbursts of vulgar platitudes." Other relatives describe his hyperactive behavior, frequent facial tics, and obsessive-compulsive tendencies. He often used to touch his napkin to his lips, make grimaces, tap his hands or feet on objects, or play with hats, pockets, tables and chairs, seemingly playing clavier. Mozart's inappropriate joking and rhyming and lack of foresight indicate issues with impulse control. All of these symptoms add up to a textbook case of Tourette's syndrome. He was always looking for love as a child and often wept from being alone. As Peter Gay points out in Mozart, Wolfgang was a needy child who constantly sought affection. Jumped into the Habsburg Empress's lap, put his arms around her neck, and earnestly kissed her, apparently hoping for a similar response, Mozart wrote when he was 6 years old. While on tour with his father, Mozart would sometimes wake up crying, and list all of the people he missed from home. He also had a habit of asking adults whether or not they loved him. Because Wolfgang was prone to pranks, adults more often than not assumed this to be a joke, and replied no in jest, causing the boy to break down and cry. He begged for money from people who knew he was rich. Mozart spent most of his adult life attempting to borrow money from friends, patrons, and publishers. He is frequently portrayed in popular culture as having been dirt poor. The life of a starving artist, dependent upon the morsels of the humble and charitable. As it turns out, this wasn't quite the truth. Mozart's frequent requests for money were made while he raked in a 10,000 florins a year, an amount that put him in the top 5% of wage earners. The upper class survived on just 450 florins a year, approximately 1/20th what Mozart earned. He lived lavishly, dressed extravagantly, traveled extensively, drank heavily, and gambled unprecedented sums. Despite his staggering income, Mozart frequently wrote to acquaintances pleading for cash, because he couldn't stop spending. His financial irresponsibility was extreme, but he was also victim to history. Mozart was obscenely irresponsible with money, yet that wouldn't have been a problem were it not for musical trends and historical circumstances beyond his control. He was an in-demand, very famous composer, but unable to find a royal court appointment after losing his post with the archbishop. While his attitude certainly didn't help in this regard, the real bane of Mozart's existence was the preference for Italian composers like Antonio Salieri, who were all the rage at the time. To make matters worse, the mid-1780s brought economic challenges for both Austria and Mozart. A war with the Ottoman Empire meant less support for the arts, and Mozart saw his income shrink. Though unable to find a court appointment, Mozart lived like had one. He resided at a fashionable address, dressed extravagantly, sent children to boarding schools, kept servants, and even stabled a horse in the Vienna woods. As debts mounted, Mozart moved his family to the suburbs. While in Vienna, he moved 9 times in 11 years. Eventually, he borrowed against future earnings, many of which never came because he died young. Constanze Mozart, Mozart's wife, spent years paying off his debts after his death in 1791 by selling his manuscripts and holding memorial concerts. She was aided by a survivor's pension provided by the Austrian government for her to return to relative prosperity. He had basically no distinguishing features, other than being really short. Mozart didn't have the distinguishing features of other geniuses, such as Beethoven's intense brow, philosopher Spinoza's wide dark eyes, or Einstein's shock of untamed hair. Rather, he was very plain. One associate described him as a remarkably small man, very thin and pale, with a profusion of fine, fair hair of which he was rather vain. An early biographer added, "There was nothing special about his physique. He was small and his countenance, except for his eyes, gave no signs of his genius. His facial complexion was pitted, a reminder of his childhood case of smallpox." For his performances, Mozart frequently donned a fiery red coat and a golden cocked hat to make up for his average appearance. Think of him as the prince of the classical era. Until the day he died, his sister thought he was an impulsive child. Mozart had 6 siblings. Maria Anna was the only one who made it to adulthood. 5 years older than her brother, Maria Anna was also a musician, and performed at a young age with her brother. Once she reached her late teens, Leopold forbid Maria Anna from playing music publicly, thinking it inappropriate and unladylike. Of her brother she wrote, "This same being who, considered as an artist, had reached the highest stage of development even from his very earliest years, remained to the end of his life completely childish in every other aspect of existence. He never learned to exercise even the most fundamental forms of self-control until he passed away. He exhibited a gross paucity of intellectual development and social awareness." It's possible Mozart was considered weird in his day due to a complete lack of intellectual or social sophistication. He was tutored by his father, but he never got an education. Thus, his intellectual and social capabilities were severely limited during key developmental years. Mozart didn't connect with children other than his sister, an 18th-century Michael Jackson. He spent his childhood performing, dominated by a father driven by ambition. This strange duality of being a musical genius but otherwise completely inept was captured by the comment of one of his contemporaries, violinist Karl Holst, who said, "Outside of his genius as a musical artist, Mozart was a nullity." Even though it is impossible to determine whether Mozart had OCD, Tourette's, or any other mental illness, it is possible that these conditions had an effect on his social skills and how other people perceived his intelligence and sophistication. The mystery surrounding his Requiem, which he died before completing. In the final weeks of his life, Mozart was approached by an intermediary of Austrian Count Franz von Wolsegg, who had the habit of commissioning works and passing them off as his own. The Count wanted Mozart to write a requiem for his wife, who had passed away recently. Mozart agreed and demanded a 50% upfront payment for the work. Before finishing the piece, Mozart died of unknown causes. Severe military fever was listed as cause of death. Constanze, his wife, hired composers to secretly finish the work so she could get the second half of Wolsegg's payment. Constanze needed money. She found herself in the difficult position of having to conceal the piece's authorship from Wolsegg in order to earn money from performances featuring Mozart's name and from the general public. The secrecy surrounding the writing of Mozart's Requiem has led to many versions of the truth, even from biographers who personally interviewed Constanze. These interviews claim that Mozart began writing what he considered to be his own Requiem when he realized that he was about to pass away. He apparently fainted numerous times while composing the work, and had it with him in bed when he died. It is unknown whether or not Franz Xaver Sussmayer, who completed the majority of the finishing, followed his notes on how he wanted it finished. The mysterious graves and remains of Mozart and his family. Many myths have arisen around the circumstances of Mozart's death and burial. It is still up for debate what actually killed him, but a combination of kidney failure and severe strep throat seems like a likely cause. His wife did not attend his funeral, which has been construed negatively, though at the time, widows were expected to stay at home mourning their husbands, so this was not unusual. After Mozart's death, it has been suggested that Constanze was unfit to leave the house because she was in such a hysterical state. So, even if she wanted to break convention and attend the funeral, she couldn't have. Contrary to what Hollywood told us, Mozart was not thrown into a mass grave in a cloth sack on a dark and stormy night. He was buried in what was known as a third-class grave, typical of the middle class of the day, on a cold winter night. This meant an individual, dirt grave in a coffin with a small marker permitted. One aspect of this third-class burial is pretty weird in modern times. Mozart's grave was only guaranteed for 10 years, after which the city had the right to dig it up, dispose of the remains, and recycle the grave. Because that is exactly what happened. The marker in St. Mark's Cemetery in Vienna denotes an approximate location of Mozart's original burial, not a grave site. There are enough irregularities concerning the burial locations, missing remains, and similar such issues with people related or otherwise connected to Mozart that researcher David E. Morton, who runs the website Mozart's Musical Trademark, compiled a massive list called Missing and Moved Mozarts and Friends. It's possible that neither his relatives nor his skull are the same. The controversy surrounding a skull at the Mozarteum, a world-renowned music university in Salzburg, arose as a result of the disappearance of Mozart's remains. The story goes like this. 50 years after Mozart died, a Viennese gravedigger gave a man named Jacob Echort a skull and said it was Mozart's. This wasn't unheard of at the time. Those in search of a payday or important relic often sought the remains of famous people in graveyards. The skull was discovered by Echwertiel's brother, an anatomy professor, who then showed it to associate Ludwig Frankel after his death in 1892. Frankel's description was published with great fanfare and controversy in an article entitled, Mozart's Skull Found. The skull was exhibited in Mozart's birthplace in Salzburg, then transferred to the Mozarteum private collection, its veracity remaining controversial. In order to settle the dispute, the Mozarteum hired DNA experts in 2006, who compared the skull material to mitochondrial DNA from Mozart's grandmother and niece, which had been exhumed from the family vault in Salzburg. The result? Inconclusive. The fact that not only did the DNA from the skull not match the two relatives, but they also didn't match each other was a major issue. It has long been assumed that the bones currently buried in the Mozart family graves in Salzburg were a ruse to attract tourists. The Mozarteum returned the skull to a private vault after the dispute was resolved. You can see it if you make a request in advance.